Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to another exciting episode of this series on modern Iran. I am once, as always, joined by a good friend, Hunger the Dye Merchant. How are you, Hunger?
I'm doing well. We should maybe we can talk about this either in the beginning or the very end of the stream. There's been a lot of news about Iran in the past few weeks. If anyone isn't living under a rock.
Yes, no, a lot of stuff going on over there at the moment. All I had to say that it's making my head spin because it's also postmodern. I've even taken to consulting Baudrillard in order to try and make sense of it.
Oh yes. The Mike of Paul influence is rubbing off on you, but it's all pro wrestling, as AA likes to say, and he's not wrong at all in this case. It's very much pro wrestling work that's happening before our eyes.
No, certainly. And just to get into what we're talking about today, so in the last stream, we looked at the fall of the Safavids, the rise of Nader Shah, and then the collapse of the Afsharid monarchy, and then the rise of Karim Khan Zand and the Zand dynasty. So we'll finish off talking about the Zands today, and then we'll be looking at the rise of the Qajars, who would be the next major dynasty to rule Iran over the course of the 19th into the early 20th century. So just to recap, so Karim Khan Zand, so he comes to power. His power base is in Fars, in the city of Shiraz, which makes his capital, and he's able to restore order over most of the country. And he doesn't call himself Shah. He takes the title of Vakil or Reaya, or Deputy of the People. Again, a very kind of, you can say, civic, even dare I say, Republican sort of title. And very much representing this idea of the center of the Persian culture and administration over the rest of the country. And I did do a bit of reading last time, sort of going over his reign. I just want to do some other reading because he very much invested in a lot of architecture and art and culture in Shiraz as well, and very much kind of helping rebuild the sort of nucleus of an Iranian state after the collapse of the Safavids and the Afsharids. Right, so everyday life in Shiraz. Beyond the political history of the period, we know something of everyday life in the Zand period. A remarkable narrative, Rostam al-Tararik, provides details about the minimum wage and the price of goods and commodities. An average labourer in Zand Shiraz earns as much as 9 tumans per year, enough, the author reckons, to feed and clothe a family of 7. The average size of an Iranian household at the time, 1 tuman consisting of 10,000 dinars, would have brought roughly all the commodities needed annually for such a family. 950 pounds of wheat, 220 pounds of various grains, 115 pounds of rice, 220 pounds of red meat, 25 chickens, and 150 eggs. Another tuman or two would have bought spices and condiments, cooking oil, salt, sugar, coffee, tobacco, soap, wood, charcoal, burning oil, vegetables and fruits, and other necessities. Clothing, mostly cotton, but also woolen and silk for special items, constituted a hefty figure, perhaps as much as 2 tumans. A quality wooden carpet of about 130 square feet was worth about a tuman and a half, but a kilim of the same size was half that price. In contrast, an average urban house cost no more than 10 tumans. Land was relatively cheap as well. 1 jarib, nearly 2.5 acres, went for only a quarter of a tuman, compared to 1 tuman for a jarib of orchard. The most prized items, however, were horses. A pedigree horse could cost as much as 20 tumans, and even the well-bred mule was no less than 10 tumans. Yet average urbanite could afford riding a very good donkey for 1 tuman, while a peasant could buy a ploughing cow for the same price and working donkey for 1/3 of that. Though raging inflation or source reforms has had led Karim Khan to introduce some measure of price controls, still the standard of living seems well within an affordable range. Rostam al-Tararik nostalgically recalls a life of prosperity and leisure under the great Vakil. The author praises Karim Khan for combating crime and restoring calm to Shiraz, well known for its harassing urban brigands, lutis. Among other measures, he instituted a liberal policy of establishing taverns and brothel districts for the troops and for the city folk, presumably to forestall the raping and abduction of women and children, an endemic problem under the Afsharid regime. The author also offers a long list of well-known female entertainers of Shiraz, whom he praises for their sophistication and taste. The charming Mullah Fatima, no doubt an educated female entertainer, was praised for her pleasant conversation. She was a good-natured, tender, and mannerly, never acted presumptuously, always compassionate to the prince and the pauper alike. She knew by heart about 20,000 select verses from classic and contemporary poets, and could recite them appropriately in every assembly, accompanied with tambourine, drum, reed, pipe, harp, lute, and Kamancher. She was also credited for her intelligent critiques of clerical bigotry and misogyny, as well as for being an advocate of the weak and disadvantaged, according to the Rostam al-Tararik. On one occasion, quoting the poet Saidi, she cautioned Karim Khan about the transitory nature of his power and the egalitarian tyranny of death. The Shiraz environment was liberal enough for Fatima not only to utter such sentiments, but also to express them in public through poetry and music. At the crossroads of the Vakil Bazaar, she and her band reportedly performed for the public, no doubt in the face of the ulama's objection. The portrayal of female entertainers became popular in the Zand paintings, and later was inherited by the artists of the early Qajar period. Large-scale oil painting on canvas celebrating the court life of leisure and merrymaking was a late Safavid development, possibly inspired by Italian and Dutch portraitures. Yet it was in the Zand era that the inner life of the harem becomes the prominent subject of a school of painting, distinct for its depiction of women, wine, and music. Portraitures of the Zand and Qajar periods showed unveiled women in private settings off limits to the public eye, an indication, no doubt, of the concern of the patrons of these works not to transgress Sharia sanctions and face criticisms of the ulama. So again, we can see this after the collapse in the early mid-18th century of the economy and society, the Zands are able to rebuild some kind of prosperous urban order where people can live comfortably. And as we also see, the culture starts taking a much, shall we say, modern bent, where, you know, women are allowed to express certain dissident political views and to the distaste of the ulama. And where have we heard that before, Ray Hunger?
No, absolutely, and I think that last sentence that you quoted was very interesting about the changes in art, the changes in Persian art under the Zands, where there were now paintings of women that were unveiled, because in Islam there's two things. Islam is not very generous when it comes to art and creativity, to say the least. But two taboos in Islam is it's very discouraged. I don't know if it's haram, but it's very discouraged to paint human forms in Islam. But that's a long tradition of Persian art. Persian art has always painted the human form. The other big taboo, which is definitely considered haram, is the woman has to be veiled in public settings, and so they can only take off the veil they can only take off their veil in their own private residence without the presence of men. And that's another thing that these paintings are transgressing against, as we see.
And something else that's also interesting, because you commented there about the portrayal of the human form. Well, one sort of hack, if you like, that a lot of Persian artists do is they employ something called miniature painting, where they paint onto paper, but the pages are in like a small book, so it's somewhat concealed, because, you know, the viewer can kind of just sit down and then, you know, you sort of browse through this book of these little paintings, and it's not quite the same. You know, it's not like these are great public murals like in the Safavid palaces, but right, it's like a little intimate little sort of picture book, so to speak.
Correct, but that will there will become in the future, during, you know, under the Qajars and under the Zands, that will become more of the style of large, you know, public murals of, you know, specifically the Shahs and the kings and the dignitaries.
No, certainly. And in terms of the sort of architectures we can see here, we've got the Agha of Karim Khan. So Agha is a Persian fortress or citadel, and this is constructed in Shiraz, and it was the main palace of the Zand dynasty. And on the right here, we've got the Vakil Bazaar, which is the main covered bazaar in Shiraz. That's another investment, and he made it. And just before we move on and talk a little bit about the orientation of the Persian Gulf, I just want to talk a little bit about the court Karim Khan Zand, because obviously I mentioned we're going to be talking about the rise of the Qajars. Well, Agha Mohammad, who would go on to be the first Qajar Shah, he would actually spend 15 years at the court of Karim Khan. And the reason for this is that when Karim Khan first solidifies his control in the 1750s, obviously the Qajars were fighting against him. And after Agha Khan's father was defeated and he becomes the leader of the Qajars, there was essentially a truce was established where, okay, we'll stop killing each other, but I'm going to need a hostage. And so Agha Khan comes to stay at the Agh in Shiraz. And one thing I find interesting is how this is presented in the book by Armanat is, again, he very much seems to lean to this idea that, Agha Khan was sort of almost like he was dragged in chains and kept in a dungeon or something, but that's very much not the case. Agha Khan was a valued guest at court, and just to draw an example, if anybody who's watched Game of Thrones, I hate to make a crass modern analogy, but it's a good example. Obviously, in that show, Theon Greyjoy is not a member of the Stark family, but he's at Winterfell with the Starks, and that's because he was given over as a hostage to the Starks by the Greyjoys for their rebellion earlier in the lore of the show, and that's based on actual dynasties in history would do this. As part of peace, you sometimes would exchange hostages in this manner, and that's essentially what Agha Khan was. He was there to ensure the Qajars wouldn't cause any trouble. And it's also interesting because Agha Khan was actually given a position as a advisor to Karim Khan, who he highly respected, and he actually gave him a title of the Pirani Vizier, which means roughly. It means roughly like, one who is intelligent or one who is clever. And it actually comes from the Shahnameh, because in the Shahnameh, there's an ancient king of Turan, or the Turks, called Afrasiab, who has an advisor also called the Pirani Vizier. So again, just drawing this sort of connection through myth and legend back to the ancient past. And so again, Karim Khan is trying to legitimize himself through linking himself to the ancient myths, but also showing a sign of respect and authority to Agha Khan, who's nominally his hostage. I wonder what your thought on that was.
Well, that's definitely not the first time this has happened in history. Another figure that people should be very familiar with is Vlad the Impaler, because he was also a prisoner at the Ottoman court for many years until he went back to Transylvania. So this is not a unique experience of holding hostages from other, I guess, royal families for political stability and I guess possible future alliances or possible future vassals. This is a very common thing, but no, it is interesting. What was I going to say? We're going to. So go ahead.
So I just want to address a comment from John, not real name. Was ascension of an illegitimate Shah as ideologically scoring in Iran as it was in Europe? Well, the problem is what do we define as illegitimate? Because we've already talked about this, where in the harem culture, as long as a male son is born to a Shah, if that son is the product of one of the Shah's wives or one of the harem women, then they're considered legitimate. The only nuance you really could get is, okay, maybe the son of the wife would have a greater claim than the son of a concubine, but that being a son of a concubine would not disbar you necessarily from claiming the throne. A very famous example of this, just to go back over into history, is under the Abbasids, Harun al-Rashid, his two eldest sons, who both were going to become caliph, one Al-Mamun, for example, was the son of a Persian concubine. His claim was weaker than his elder brother, who took over as Shah when Harun al-Rashid died. But this, by being descended from the caliph, Al-Mamun had a claim so much that Harun al-Rashid actually gave him governorship of the Persian provinces when he died. And from that position, Al-Mamun was able to achieve a successful rebellion against his brother and usurp the caliphate for himself. So that's more or less how it works. But you're not disbarred, but it's certainly no easy claim, you still would have to resist other claimants to the throne.
No, that's correct. If I could go back to Karim Khan for a second, because I think his reign is very, very important. We've talked about this in the previous episode, where Iran was in a very precarious position. There had been decades of civil war. There was a huge succession crisis, before Nader Shah and after Nader Shah, which was very distraught. A lot of tribal, rural rebellions happened with local tribal chieftains taking over their territories. The Uzbeks had invaded Mashhad and Merv. The Afghans had invaded Kandahar and Herat. So there were plenty of chunks that were being taken out of the Persian Empire at this time. But Karim Khan, despite not taking back a lot of those major cities, was an incredibly successful, stable ruler for a period of 2 decades. It was the most stability Iran had experienced in probably a century at that time. And I wanted to know if you'd like to comment on that.
Well, again, one of the themes you talked about in this series is the center versus the periphery. The success of the Safavids was to marry the center and periphery together. And the problem is the dislocation of that is why the Safavid Empire explodes in such a destructive manner. And when Nader Shah comes along, the reason he's not successful long term is that he only represents the periphery. He only represents the tribal warriors, and he doesn't represent the divan or the ulama, and that's why he's assassinated. And Karim Khan, as successful as he was, I think ultimately the Zands were not successful long term because they only represented, again, the center and couldn't adequately, incorporate the periphery into their political system. Unlike when we get to Aga Khan and the Qajars, their success is being able to do that, to in a way recreate that old Safavid model by marrying the two.
No, absolutely, and this is very apparent if you look at the two bases of power. Nader's base of power was Mashhad, which is obviously in the northeast. Again, a very, very large but very peripheral tribal city. Whereas the Zands, their center of power was in Shiraz, which was very close to Isfahan. It's a few hours south of Isfahan, actually, but very close also to the Persian Gulf. And that the Persian center, the Persian center of the country was around Shiraz and Isfahan. And so that de-emphasized, again, the tribal nature of the hinterlands, and also brought them closer to trade in the Persian Gulf, which is a very, it's the urban versus rural type system, because urban areas need ports and port access.
No, certainly. And speaking of the Persian Gulf, I now want to read another little bit from the book talking about the Persian Gulf. So, public space remained primarily a male domain. The Vakil Bazaar and the adjacent caravansaries were not constructed merely to augment the ruler's image or to please the growing out-of-town visitors. They served as the main outlets for the emerging mercantile classes and as a new market for the Persian Gulf trade being conducted through the port of Bushehr, the main entrepot for Fars province. The piracy common in the lower Persian Gulf, French naval attacks on English ships in the area, and the growing maritime ambitions of the Imam of Muscat and his Omani privateers undermined most of the trade of the lower Persian Gulf. And I should also note that with the rise of this Omani Empire, as it's called, this sort of great Arab thalassocracy throughout the Indian Ocean and East Africa, the Omanis are actually able to coerce the Zands to let them lease Bandar Abbas, and Bandar Abbas would actually remain de facto an Omani possession up until the late 19th century. So again, Iran is actually losing control of its coastal cities to foreign powers. Almost a little bit like the Chinese situation with the legation cities such as Shanghai and Hong Kong. By the mid-18th century, Bandar Abbas gradually ceased to function as Iran's chief port of entry. The British East India Company and Dutch commercial firms searched for a safe harbour along the upper shores of the Persian Gulf. The first settled in Bushehr and Karg Islands, and soon after in the rival port of Basra, which was the outlet of Ottoman Iraq to the Persian Gulf. Despite Iran's desire to safeguard its southern shores in its foreign trade, its greatest weakness in establishing a secure presence in the Persian Gulf was its lack of either a naval or a commercial fleet. Nader's effort to build a naval force was a notable exception. By 1745, he had gathered a fleet of more than 20 boats of different sizes, purchased from the Portuguese or constructed in India. Portuguese officers and Indian sailors largely manned his navy. He also built a dockyard in Bushire at great expense and with much difficulty. He transported timber from Mazandaran for the construction of warships. The major objective was to quell privateers along the Iranian coasts and revive maritime trade, although it is conceivable that he had maritime ambitions in the Indian Ocean. Nader also used the expertise of an Englishman to build a fleet in the Caspian Sea, with a similar objective of securing the Iranian coast from Turkmen and Cossack piracy. He also appointed for the first time an admiral, Diabeg, to organise Iranian defences in the Persian Gulf. Yet after Nader's assassination, the Omanis would resume the raids on the Iranian coasts, even carrying off ships of his navy. By the time of Karim Khan, the rule of Muscat and the Qasimi privateers, who were operating from the southern coast of the Persian Gulf, were capable of barring Iran from effective control of its own coast. Any effort to establish a naval presence in the upper Persian Gulf, moreover, was bound to face heavy competition from the semi-autonomous Mamluks of Iraq. While keeping their Ottoman suzerain at bay, the Mamluks were eager to host the lucrative trade of the East India Company. This offered the English unprecedented freedom to dictate terms and win greater concessions by playing the Iraqi Mamluks against the Zands. Even the joint military operation in 1768 by the Iranians, the Mamluks, and the East India Company, intended to crush the Kab tribes of the banks of the Shatt al-Arab waterway, did not result in further commercial cooperation. It did, however, whet Karim Khan's appetite for expansion not only in the Persian Gulf but also across the frontiers of Ottoman Iraq. Counting on the weakness of the Mamluks of Iraq and the Sublime Porte's sluggish response, Karim Khan lent substantive efforts to the chiefs of the Iraqi Kurdistan, who sought autonomy from their Turkish masters. But it was above all the vigorous English backing of the Ottomans in disputes with the Iranian states that in 1774 persuaded Karim Khan to send a force under the command of his brother Sadek Khan to capture Basra, the valuable strategic and commercial lifeline of Mesopotamian trade. This was the first time since Nader's overland sorties into the Ottoman territory that Iranian advances had paid off in Iraq, albeit momentarily. The fragile 5-year Zand occupation of Basra, which ended with Karim Khan's death in 1779, proved a failure. It interrupted the export of Persian silk and pearls from Bahrain to Europe, and it discouraged profitable trade with Mughal India, now largely fragmented into regional princely states and progressively prey of French and British colonial gains. Moreover, it demonstrated the difficulty Iran faced in securing an important commercial outlet to the Indian Ocean, not only to compete with expanding European trade, but also to outmaneuver Ottoman Iraq. As an alternative to the Persian Gulf, Karim Khan also followed Nader's steps in developing the northern Caspian trade with Russia, which was largely conducted from Astrakhan on the Caspian's northern shore. The chief beneficiaries of that trade, however, were not the Zand, but the northern-based Qajars, who soon after Karim Khan's death emerged as the chief contenders for control of Iran. Russian commercial and diplomatic presence along the southern and western shores of the Caspian, which included Armenian and Muslim traders, relations with Baku, Anzali, and Astarabad, anticipated Russia's territorial advances in the early decades of the 19th century. Yes, so as you can see, there is an attempt under the Afsharids and the Zands to expand commercial control, again, a logical extent of the policies of Abbas the Great. But unfortunately, due to the weakness of the central government, they're not able to fully push out any foreign influence. And I think ultimately it's a bit of a limited measure. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, even with the help of European support, they couldn't retake control of the Persian Gulf. The Omanis were wreaking havoc everywhere. And despite controlling Basra for 5 years, it was all for naught because of the death of Karim Khan. And still, I mean, maybe it could be argued still to this day, but for the rest of the century at least, Iran never had a powerful navy or merchant fleet. Arguably still doesn't, but that's just another thing. The caravan system was very powerful. It was very stable. It's an incredibly old tradition. But again, the state was never able to exercise control over the Persian Gulf as much as they would have liked to.
Oh, no, certainly. And just to address some more comments from a John Not Real Name, the son of a concubine had no disability in ascending to the throne. Sorry, I meant illegitimate in the sense of rival noble family, not bastardy. Well, as I said, the problem with the system is that you tend to have lots of different sons, And so, the Ottoman solution to it for a time was official state-sanctioned fratricide, where when the Sultan dies, all of the various brothers have to outmaneuver each other to eliminate their rivals before securing the throne. Later on, they would adopt a policy of agnatic succession, where the oldest male member of the House of Osman becomes the Sultan, and the rest of the male members have to stay locked in the harem for their own safety and protection until such a time as they can ascend to the throne. The Safavids ultimately, as we've discussed, when you have these series of complacent shahs, ultimately it's the divan who decides which of the sons of the previous shah are going to get the throne, essentially. So they found their unique ways around it. And another comment from John, not real name. I know that in the 1980s, Pakistan allowed, I think, Oman to let them bring up men for service. Is this to do with former ownership? Yes, because there's a port in Pakistani Balochistan called Jask, and that was another port that the Omanis controlled in the Indian Ocean, similar to Bandar Abbas. So, and even to this day, with all of this crazy wars that are going on between Iran and Israel, America, the Omanis are still valued as a trusted go-between, America and Iran, because of their strategic position on the Persian Gulf.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very often that Omani interlocutors and negotiators are going between the Iranians and the Americans because they're playing both sides. The U.S. Navy has a enormous presence in the Persian Gulf, particularly in Qatar, and in a huge air base in Bahrain. But that's a conversation for later in the series, possibly.
No, certainly. And so at this point, we should probably so how do things go wrong for the Zand? Well, Karim Khan dies in 1779, and when he's sort of dying, Agha Khan uses that opportunity to flee the court and go back to the Qajar base in the north, or in Tehran. I think very sensibly, because I think he knew what was going to happen next. Because when Karim Khan dies, there was an absolute bloodbath over the succession. After Karim Khan, between 1779 and the death of the last of the Zands, Fath Ali Khan, in 1794, there were 8 Zand rulers, and all of but one would die a violent death. And what's also interesting is what all of these later Shah rulers do is they don't, like Karim Khan, sensibly adopt, vacula rea, deputy of the people, rather than just adopting a position that's good enough to show that they are the executive. They claim and call themselves Shahs. And I think this is what part of their undoing, because, again, up to this point, there is a Shah, that is Shah Rukh Shah, the grandson of Nader Shah, who is off in Khorasan. And I think very wisely, in terms of keeping the peace while he expanded his power base, Karim Khan never claimed the Shahdom, because he knew as soon as he did that had a risk of unraveling things. So, what's the point in being called Shah in name if it's just going to unravel my political project? Unfortunately, the rest of the Zands,
exactly,
yeah, and the rest of the Zands don't understand that, and that's part of the reason why things go to shit after Karim Khan dies. And also there's just mutual rivalry. So so after his immediate death, you have about 2 or 3 different relatives try to claim the throne, ruling for about weeks or only days, until finally Sadek Khan, who is his younger brother, becomes the Shah in 1779. He only lives for 2 years before being murdered himself. Then we have another Zand, Ali Murad Khan, for a few years before he's then replaced by Jafar Khan. And so you see that, again, there's a complete breakdown of order, because all the Zands keep murdering each other. Now you've got the Qajars are in the north, are now rebelling and on the warpath again. And just a complete shit show. And it's just really, it's incredible, because I can't really think of any other example in history of a country where a dynasty collapses, there's a civil war, a new dynasty comes in, only for that dynasty to destroy itself within a generation. Of course, another civil war, another dynasty comes in, then destroys itself in a generation, and the cycle seems to repeat ad nauseum for a period of 75 years. I just cannot think of any other country where something like this has happened.
Yeah, well, it speaks to the instability that is the background of of Persian politics. The difference between the urban and the rural elites, the difference between the Kizilbash, again, tribal power versus, Persian central culture, especially in places like Shiraz. Karim Khan was a very effective I think the right word is interregnum. His rule was a very competent interregnum of balancing all of these powers together. But clearly, each of his descendants was not half the man he was and couldn't hold all of these things together, as well as probably being degenerates and pursuing their own interests. So that really speaks to the number of factors that go into a stable political order in Persia is actually very, very difficult and very enormous. And it takes an incredibly strong, competent ruler to hold it all together. This is not the first time it's collapsed, but whenever it reforms itself, it's always under a strong, competent, wise, and merciful leader. Actually, again, and the merciful part is going to be very important for the ruler's legitimacy.
No, certainly. Aunt Party. Point curiosity, did the title Khan originate with the Mongols? Yes, that goes all the way back to the Mongol conquest. So many of the tribal clans in Persia, Iran, are of Turco-Mongol ancestry. And so if you're a member, you get to use the title Khan as part of your name. The only exception is that if you become a Shah, you get to use the title Shah instead. So, for example, we're talking about Agha Khan, he would become, Agha Mohammad Khan Qajar becomes Agha Mohammad Shah Qajar. You kind of just upgrade the title. And so now here we come to the final showdown between the Zands and the Qajars. So on the left, we've got the last of the Zands and Fath Ali Khan. And then here we've got Agha Mohammad Khan. And so we're talking a little bit before the stream, Hunker, about Agha Khan. And again, I just talked about this idea that, a country where 75 years, 3 different dynasties implode, and then the successors also implode within a rapid succession. Well, we also see another historical outlier where we have someone who is, because it should be noted that Agha Khan had a very traumatic childhood, because when he was 6 years old, this was at the time that Nader Shah was assassinated, and one of the other Afsharid princes, during a mopping up operation where he was eliminating his rivals, has Agha Khan castrated when he was 6 years old. And obviously, as you can imagine, that's an incredibly brutal thing to do to a child. And so the reason this was done was to weaken any claim Agha Khan would have on the throne of Iran, because by being castrated, he would obviously not be able to produce any heirs or children. And normally that would just be a death knell to any ambitions one would have on the throne or political office. Again, this is a practice that's very common in the Byzantine court, something I know, Hunger, you're probably quite familiar with. And, when you take the throne, what do? You blind and castrate the former emperor and lock them up in the dungeon. Very cutthroat. And
many such cases.
And obviously as a result of this, Agha Khan, obviously by not producing sufficient testosterone for most of his life, he was a bit of a manlet. He was only 4.5 foot. He never grew a beard. And in fact, I was reading, there were accounts that from a distance, he looked like a child, and this really annoyed him because people would stare at him in a weird way. And so,
poor guy. Speaking of incel, he's the incel Shah. But no, it's incredibly tragic what happened to Agha Mohammad, and he bounces back from it very, very rapidly. Again, he escapes Karim Khan's palace after his death, goes back to the Qajar home. Oh god.
No, correction, no. He flees just before Karim Khan dies because he knows that shit's about to hit the fan. So very smart of him. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah, he escaped back. He escapes back to the northeast. You know, the Qajar homeland, the Kezelbash homeland, and from there, um, he's an adult at this time. He's a very violent person.
Well, I wouldn't say. Well,
No.
not Cuckshar. He's a eunuch Shah, because again, when I meant earlier when he was made this advisor, the Pirani vizier, he's literally the eunuch to Shah pipeline. Actually, very
No,
fitting
indeed.
in a Persian context in some weird way.
It's quite sad. I mean, it's quite sad, and it's obviously an incredibly traumatic experience. Also, growing up in captivity. But so Agha Mohammad flees Shiraz. He goes back to the Qajar homelands. He brings up all of his forces, and they go on the warpath, particularly in the northeast of Iran. The Afsharids are still around, and the Afsharids are the arch rivals of the Qajars. They'll be, but they won't be dealt with for a brief period of time. They'll be dealt with later in the story. Agha Muhammad is just as violent as Nader Shah. While he's on the warpath, he massacres a lot. He commits a lot of massacres in his time. But I would say he's gaining up his power base. But the figure that is incredibly important in the rise of Agha Mohammad is the man to his right, Haji Ibrahim Shirazi. Very important figure. He was a notable of Shiraz, which was, again, the capital of the Zand dynasty. I believe he was also the governor of Fars province, although
Yes,
that might have come later.
No, he was from 1785 to 1795. He was the Kalantar, or governor of Fars, and he's then made the Grand Vizier of Agha Mohammad.
Yes, he was a very prominent, very powerful and influential, notable, incredibly wealthy, had numerous lands and titles, very influential in the city. And so the story goes, while Fath Ali Zand was while he was out of the city, he left Shiraz to go on campaign. On his way back to Shiraz, Haji Ibrahim shuts the city gates in front of him and doesn't allow him back into the city because at this time Haji Ibrahim was conducting secret negotiations with Agha Mohammad. Haji Ibrahim was not a believer in the successors of the Zand dynasty. He was not a believer in any of the successors of Karim Khan. He found them incredibly wanting, incredibly petty, incredibly degenerate, and for whatever reason, he believed Agha Mohammad would be a better ruler and would be intelligent enough and capable enough to unify the empire again. And did you want to add anything else on Haji Ibrahim?
No, what I wanted to say though about Agha Khan, because we mentioned this idea of him being very violent. Well, despite him being castrated, he was actually be a frequent employer of these exact same methods on his enemies. So it's like the ultimate form of revenge. Well, if you castrate me, fine, I'll castrate you. I'll cut your ears off, and deploy all these other like horrific acts of like disfigurement and torture. And there's even a term Armonite uses in the book, which is the 18th century is the golden age of mutilation, including frequent blindings, castrations, and removal of the tongue, and partial removal of the nose or ears. So lovely stuff.
Yeah, lovely stuff. There's a comment from John, not real name. We should probably address that. On that point, I thought the Shirazi hated the Qajars. They do. Shiraz, the city of Shiraz, was the Zand stronghold and capital. But Haji Ibrahim, it's debatable whether this is for his personal ambitions, his personal protection, or he just saw the writing on the wall and he wanted. We'll get to a quote of Ibrahim later. It's a very good quote that we'll get to. But for either personal ambition or safety, he believed Fath Ali could not defeat Agha Mohammad, and so he bet on the strong horse and betrayed Fath Ali and the Zand dynasty in favor of the Qajars.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Sorry. Is this like the 100 Years' War? No, because this is a. I mean, do you mean War of the Roses, John? Not real name, because that's a better comparison. Because that's a dynastic civil war within England. The 100 Years' War was the Plantagenet monarchs of England trying to claim the throne of France. I presume that's what you mean there. Right, there's actually so ultimately with Agha Khan, his success is he's able to rehabilitate the divan and the mullahs with the tribal periphery. So again, he's like a Nader Shah if Nader Shah was more politically savvy.
No, absolutely. And at this time, this is where yes, incredibly strong beard game. Yeah, so Haji Ibrahim opens the city gates of Shiraz to Agha Mohammad, and he captures the city in 1792. Sorry.
I see what John's getting at. Okay, yeah. So in the 100 Years' War, the Burgundians, a junior branch of the House of Valois under Philip the Good, were originally supporters of the English, but they critically defect to the Valois, who want to restore the I think it's Charles VII to the throne of France, and who's obviously being supported by Joan of Arc. So again, the point is that you have an important figure who defects on one side to the other. Okay, I get where John's coming from now. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, so no, sorry. Just as I was mentioning, Haji Ibrahim shuts the city gates, shuts the city gates of Shiraz for Fath Ali, and he's unable to come back into the city, and he flees to a different. I can't remember the town in Iran, but a different town, another stronghold of the Zands, and he opens the gates of the city to Agha Mohammad, and he captures the city of Shiraz, the Zand capital, in 1792. And I'm going to read the quotes that Haji Ibrahim gives when talking about why he did what he did, and this is years later after the Qajars are already in power in Iran. And this is the quote from Amanat. Haji Ibrahim has often been judged harshly judged by posterity, seldom credited for his motivations to cure Iran of tribalism and civil war. The British representative of the East India Company, Captain John Malcolm, who met Haji Ibrahim shortly before the Grand Vizier's downfall, advised him to respond with a better temper to the Shah's occasional fit of ill humor and violence. In response, the Vizier restated his yearning for a unified country under a strong government. I could easily save myself, but Persia again be plunged in warfare. My objective has been to give my country one king. I cared not whether he was a Zand or a Qajar, so that there was an end of internal destruction. I have seen enough of these scenes of blood. I will be concerned in no more of them. So yes, Haji Ibrahim lived through an incredibly bloody, tumultuous time in Persian Iran. And given the century of tribal chieftains and rebellions and uprisings and civil wars, there needed to be a new dynasty, a dynasty that could unify all of Iran under one Shah. And that was his motivation.
And it's also worth commenting, because if we think about the choices here, okay, we've got the Zands who are claiming the Shahdom, we've got the Qajars, and then we've got obviously Shah Rukh Shah, who's the Afshars. Both the Zands and the Afshars have held the throne before and, proven that they're not worthy. So it's almost like I'd rather go with an uncertainty in the Qajars than a bad certainty in the Zands or the Afshars. Would you say that's a fair point?
Probably. I think from Ibrahim's own experience being the governor of Fars, he probably knew better than most how incompetent the Zands were, and he probably saw something in Agha Mohammad during his time in captivity. I can't be certain of that, but that would not surprise me, because the timeline fits.
One other thing I'll say is obviously Ibn Khaldun's concept of Asabiyya is coming to my mind, and it's incredible how with the Zands and the Afshars they seem to be speed running the Asabiyya, because Ibn Khaldun says normally it's 100 years for a dynasty to degenerate, but the Zands and Afshars did it in like what 1-2 generations. So
absolutely.
Mm.
No, definitely a speed run. They were going for the speed run record.
No, certainly. And another thing I want to talk about now is obviously one major change in the political balance is that with the Qajars, the capital of Iran, moves from Shiraz to Tehran. And it's interesting because Tehran was obviously it was a provincial town. It only had like, what, 20,000 people. So you've got this small town that's a little bit of a backwater suddenly becoming the center of an ancient empire. And so again, there's a shift from power from the south to the north, and Tehran would actually be relatively small for most of the 19th century. It wouldn't actually be until the very tail end of the 19th century that Tehran would actually become the largest city. But I just want to read another segment from the book from Amanat about Aga Khan. So, on the throne in Tehran, by Nowruz of March 1786, when Agha Mohammad Khan declared Tehran his capital, it was as if Iran was about to witness another contest for Safavid succession. Earlier on, Agha Mohammad Khan was still loyal enough to the memory of the demised dynasty to issue new coins on behalf of yet another obscure Safavid prince, but with his own name included. The date for choosing his new capital, however, carried a centennial significance, as if the beginning of the 13th Islamic century marked the end of the Safavid era and the start of a new imperial fortune. That he now issued coins into circulation, this time in the name of the Mahdi, the 12th Shia Imam, was not accidental. Most likely it pointed at his presumption that his rise to power was a prelude to a new imperial era, not dissimilar to the rise of Ismail I at the beginning of the 10th Islamic century. Likewise, as Isfahan was a millennial city for Abbas I, so was Tehran a centennial capital for the Qajars. He was no longer a regional contender but an autonomous ruler who, utilising the revenues of the Caspian trade and on the backs of his Turkmen, Kurdish and Afghan mercenaries, secured northern and central Iran and even held a shaky grip over Isfahan. The choice of Tehran, a leafy town in the southern foothills of the central Alborz range, over Isfahan proved to have lasting consequences. The locale offered an ideal strategic advantage, for it was a gateway to the Iranian interior and provided easy access to Astarabad and the other Qajar strongholds in the north. Moreover, being devoid of a sizable urban population, Tehran was free from Isfahan's pro-Safavid and Shiraz's pro-Zand sentiments. The Alborz range immediately north of the city proved a natural wall of defence, and its many ravines and gorges afforded a great hunting grounds with an abundance of game. These features were quite attractive to the Qajars, as they had been earlier to the Safavid rulers who had erected a wall around the town and constructed a citadel, and to Karim Khan, who built a small residence where the Qajars later built the Golestan Palace complex. On its southern edge were the ancient ruins of Regis, a city of biblical fame, and later the city of Ray in the early Islamic era. Not far from the edge of the central Iranian desert, Tehran was blessed with another natural defence against southern sources. The new capital under the Qajars thus came to represent the rising north versus the weakening south. Its geopolitical polarity was to be affirmed in the decades to come by the arrival of the European powers on the opposite sides of the Iranian plateau, the Russians on Iran's northern frontiers and British India on its south. Not before the 20th century, however, would Tehran supersede Tabriz or Isfahan in size or significance. As a first step after declaring the new capital, Agha Mohammad Khan aimed to capture the south from the Zands. Since 1786, his repeated attempts had faced stiff resistance, most recently from the last and most charismatic of the Karim Khan successors, Fath Ali Khan Zand. The young heir to the waning Zands had repelled the Qajar army 3 times, once driving it out of Isfahan. He spent his entire fragile reign on campaigns, most of them against the Qajars in attempts to hold the Zand stronghold in the south. Yet the disruptive effects of his campaigns were all the more evident to the war-exhausted people of Fars, and especially to the landowning nobility of Shiraz, who were asked to finance his campaigns. After more than a decade of conflict and economic disruption, some had come to accept the reality of the Zand's eclipse. Among them was the chief administrator of the province of Fars, Haji Ibrahim Shirazi, better known as the Kalantar mayor, a shrewd statesman with influence throughout the south. Haji Ibrahim Kalantar apparently found nothing more redeeming in Fath Ali Khan than in any of the 7 Zand claimants before him. In 1792, while the prince was out campaigning, Haji Ibrahim conducted secret negotiations with Agha Mohammad Khan in return for his own security and ability to retain his property and those of his relatives and cohorts, and perhaps with an eye towards the safety of the people of the city. He promised to deliver Shiraz to the Qajar Khan. Upon Fath Ali's return, Haji Ibrahim ordered the city gates shut and denied him entry into his capital. Through bargaining and stratagems, the mayor then brought off some of the prince's tribal chiefs and imprisoned others while encouraging the rest of the Zand forces around Shiraz to disperse. The desperate Fath Ali had no choice but to take refuge in Kerman in the hopes of mustering enough pro-Zand recruits to recapture Shiraz. By switching sides, Haji Ibrahim opened the gates of Shiraz to the eventual Qajar supremacy. Although later in the Pahlavi era he would become a target of the anti-Qajar narratives, painted as the harbinger of the Qajar calamity, in reality he was a savvy notable who garnered urban influence and economic power to safeguard his city and his own land and property. He was a partner with Agha Mohammad Khan in making Qajar Iran a more stable and enduring state. In July 1792, Agha Mohammad Khan took over Shiraz, but he spared the ordinary people from his usual retribution. However, he saved a number of Zand women and children as war booty and sent them to his new capital to be dispersed in the royal harem and among the Qajar chiefs. To keep his side of the bargain, he reaffirmed Haji Ibrahim as the governor of Fars and gave him the title of Khan, a rare honour for an urbanite. Suspicious of potential pro-Zand sentiments in his new seasonal campaign, he ordered the fortified city walls and fortifications around the citadel to be levelled. The purpose of destroying Karim Khan's edifices was to deny the city notables the advantage that earlier they had used against the Zand prince. He further carried off the marble columns and doors of Karim Khan's palace in Shiraz to be reinstalled in the Golestan Palace in Tehran. Eventually, he even ordered Karim Khan's bones to be exhumed and reburied beneath the threshold of Golestan's Paris reception hall, reportedly along with the remains of Nader Shah, where he could step over them every day. He thus callously repaid Karim Khan for saving him from certain death, keeping him as a guest in his court for 15 years. 2 years later, on his next visit to Shiraz, he appointed Haji Ibrahim as his Sadr-e-Azam, chief minister. The first time in recent memory that such rank had been recognized in the Iranian Divan. His successor Fath Ali Shah also bestowed on him the title of Etamad al-Dawla, trustee of the state, reserved in the past for the Safavid chief ministers, thus anticipating the revival of an elaborate system of titles and honorifics in the Qajar period. He also recruited a number of trusted Zand officials to his nascent divan, which until then had been relied on northern bureaucrats from Mazandaran. The Southerners soon formed a powerful faction in the divan and largely responsible for setting the tone of the bureaucratic culture of the Qajar era. The main thrust of Agha Mohammad Khan's ferocity was reserved for Fath Ali Khan and the people of Kerman. In 1794, he eventually reached Kerman at a time that the city was riddled by sectarian divisions. The majority of the population supported the Zands, while the minority backed the Qajars. Fath Ali Khan's escape before the Qajar forces, but his taking refuge in the besieged city, enraged Agha Mohammad Khan to such an extreme that he ordered the city to be looted and thousands of its civilians, including women and children, to be killed, raped, and enslaved. Reportedly, he also ordered the gouging out of 20,000 pairs of eyes of the city's residents. Whether this is historically accurate or not, there is no doubt about the level of cruelty displayed by his troops. Even the Qajar historians of the time witnessed and recorded the Mongolian-like atrocities of the Qajar army and the ferocity of the mostly Sunni Turkmen troops against the Shiite inhabitants. When Fath Ali Khan was finally captured, the Qajar Khan ordered his eyes to be gouged out and his troops to rape him before sending him to Tehran for execution. His tragic end is recorded in Persian memory, especially in folk songs of the Fars countryside. In the popular memory, his image of valour, virtue, and heroism stood in contrast to Agha Mohammad Khan's vengeful conduct and unhealthy physique, whose deep facial wrinkles, high-pitched voice, and small stature long been subjects of contempt and ridicule, imperfections that theoretically should have disqualified him for kingship. And again, I think that ultimately explains why Agha Mohammad won, because he was a ruthless bastard.
Yeah, absolutely. And and he didn't stop there. You know, Agha Mohammad did go on to basically reunify almost all of Persia. I think the only exception was Herat, which used to be the eastern capital of the Safavids. But other than Herat and Merv, that was pretty much he did unify the entire empire. His campaigns, and Amanat goes into this in the book, his campaigns specifically in Georgia and Armenia were also incredibly ruthless, which did help in the future set the stage for the Russian Empire to expand into the Southern Caucasus. But we'll get to that when we talk about Fath Ali, his nephew.
Certainly, and here's a map of the Qajar Empire in the early 19th century. So you essentially have all of modern Iran plus the Caucasian territories, Armenia, modern as a country of Azerbaijan, and a good chunk of Georgia. and then a lot of these eastern territories in Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, cities such as Merv and Herat are sort of disputed, and so starting to head towards the actual modern borders of Iran as we know it. Okay, and so you mentioned the Caucasus campaign. So this Caucasus campaign is the most ruthless campaign he conducts. This is in 1795. He besieges Tiflis, modern Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, which he sacks, and thousands are killed and raped, churches are looted, and priests are drowned, and 15,000 people are enslaved and then sent back to Tehran. And so this has largely been because the Principality of Karkheti, which had been a long-standing and Persian vassal, had rebelled and had gone over and claimed Russian protection. And again, as you alluded to, this is the casus belli the Russians used to later attack and try and pry these provinces away from Iran in the Russo-Persian wars of the early 19th century. This incident, and so Agha Mohammad, he's then crowned Shah in 1796 formally on the plain of Mogan, again the same plain where Nader Shah had held his own Kurultai decades before. And here Haji Ibrahim pleads for him to accept the crown, and he is also girded with the sword of Ismail I. And a new crown is fashioned from gold-plated copper and named the Khayanid crown after the dynasty in the Shahnameh. He also wears 2 armlets with the Darya-e-Nur and Tajimar diamonds, again, loots that Nader Shah brought back from India. And the chroniclers actually brand the dynasty Safavid Qajar. So there is this intricate weaving of the elements of both the Safavids and Afsharids being sort of grafted onto this new Qajar dynasty. So yes, Agha Mohammad, other than his brutality, was also, I think, a master of shall we say, political optics. Would you say that's fair?
Oh, for sure, absolutely. And the optics of the continuity as well, from the Safavids to the Afsharids to the Qajars. Another very important thing that Haji Ibrahim and Agha Mohammad do is Haji Ibrahim presents Agha Mohammad the sword of Ismail. It's a ceremonial sword, but it's very much a symbolic passing down of the continuity. Because Ismail was obviously the founder of the Safavid Empire, so this myth of continuity is what gives the Qajars a lot of their legitimacy, which allows them to stabilize the empire.
No, certainly. And it's also important to remember that every I think not every, but most Safavid Shahs were actually, because this is actually a tradition in the Ottoman Empire and in Iran, is that rather than being coronated, you have what's called a sword girding. And so the Ottoman sultans would be girded with the sword of Osman whenever a new sultan came to the throne. And same with the Safavids, they'd be girded with the sword of Ismail. And Agha Mohammad doing this, again, is providing a form of legitimation to his rule.
It's like the return of the king. The king always has a sword. Yeah.
Yeah, the return of the king, but just with like a load of murder, rape, and torture thrown in.
As expected. So do we want to get to the assassination of
yes.
Agha Mohammad Shah?
So Agha Mohammad, as ruthless and brutal as he was, I think on some level his brutality led to his downfall, because on a final what he next does is, after this Georgian campaign, he goes to Khorasan and he kills Shahrukh Shah, the last of the Asharids, and is the cue that leads to him being coronated as Shah, because all pretenders have been destroyed and dealt with, and now the only enemies he has left are some unruly tribes. And so it's really now just a mopping up operation. And he makes several demands. He wants to return Balkh and Herat from the Afghans and Merv from the Uzbeks. He then launches a final campaign in the Caucasus, where he's assassinated by 2 servants of his. And this is where the Tiflis campaign comes to bite him in the arse, because the servants were Georgian survivors of that campaign. And so, according to legend, Aga Khan had condemned them to death on rather innocuous charges. I think one of them, like, I don't know, like dropped a tray or something, or like didn't quite follow an order properly. And he very flippantly just says, right, I'm having you executed tomorrow. And when it's happening, is one of his generals, Asadek Khan Shikaki, then kind of is able to meet with the servants and say, right, the Shah's going to kill you, you might as well assassinate him for me. And what ends up happening is the next day, when they go to do the night before the execution, these two servants are able to get into his tent, and they are able to stab him to death. And what then happens is this Sadek Khan then runs off with the crown and the other prized possessions and flees off into his base in Azerbaijan. And so, for a moment here, despite all the hard work of Aga Khan, all his work is almost undone over a very silly and ill-judged move. It's incredible, isn't it?
Yes, but luckily he has a very competent Grand Vizier. Haji Ibrahim is still around. Thank good for the Qajars. This was a saving grace. Otherwise, the dynasty could have ended right then and there with the death of Agha Mohammad. But Haji Ibrahim, taking stock of the situation, along with Agha's nephew, Fath Ali, who would later become Fath Ali Shah, they go back to Tehran to regroup. After the death of the king, the campaigns in the Caucasus stop. All the tribal chieftains and their armies go back to their base. It's a very tense moment that the empire might disintegrate. But Haji Ibrahim and Fath Ali are very quick to get rid of the competing Qajar claimants to the throne. Again, because Agha Mohammad was a eunuch, he didn't have any descendants, but he had numerous uncles and cousins and nephews that could have taken the Qajar throne. And Fath Ali, his favorite nephew, was the one to act quickly and decisively enough to forestall that from happening. The good thing, another positive about Agha Mohammad, although this is pretty dark, is that unlike the Zands and unlike the Afsharids, he was much more effective at getting rid of successors, getting rid of potential usurpers and successors than his predecessors were, which paved the way for Fath Ali to take the throne and become the undisputed, crown prince.
Yes, it should be noted that Fath Ali was the regnal name before he's crowned Shah. He was known as Baba Khan, just to clarify on that point. So he would take Fath Ali as his regnal name, and Fath Ali was actually, I believe, the name of Aga Khan's grandfather. So again, trying a link back to that grandfather was the one who I think would actually led the Qajar efforts when they were trying to shore up the Safavids in the collapse of the Safavid Empire. And so obviously after this point, there's been a lot of doom and gloom. And there's another section from the book I want to read. It's called Reflections on a Gloomy Century. So the 18th century, with the exception of the Zand interlude, ranked Iran quite poorly. Even compared to the Ottoman Empire and its Tulip era, the once thriving Persian garden appeared dreary and dry. Yet 18th century Iran was not devoid of cultural agility or intellectual inquiry. Liberated from the strictures of the late Safavid Shia dogma, one might argue writers, poets, and artists benefited from the Safavids' cultural repository. Reflecting on the political climate of their own time, they expressed predictably a sense of gloom but not helplessness, even in exile or in captivity. One early example was Sheikh Muhammad Ali Hazin, a representative of the Persian scholarly and literary elite of the period. A prodigy from Isfahan, brought up in the universalistic tradition of the Safavid education, he witnessed the agonies of the Afghan occupation and the rise of Nadir before immigrating to Hindustan in 1734, that being India. In a brain drain that continued throughout the 18th century, thousands of scholars, artists, artisans, poets, writers, merchants, bureaucrats, and religious dissidents took refuge in India. Some escaped the Shia conservatism that had set in. Others wanted to avoid the political insecurity that ensured after the Safavids' fall. The Mughal court and later the Muslim and Hindu successor princely states were generous patrons and promoters of Persian culture, whether statecraft, historiography, poetry, music, art, cuisine, or court culture. Yes, it should be noted that the most famous of these was Tipu Sultan, who was ruled a state in the south of India, and he actually his court language was Persian, so which just shows you how much respect he had for Persian civilization. And despite French and English colonial inroads, there was still an appetite for culture and plenty of material wealth in local kingdoms from Kashmir and Bengal to Golconda, Awadh, Deccan, and Mysore being the realm of the Tipu Sultan. Just to name a few, all of which patronised Persian newcomers, employed as secretaries, munshis, advisors, poets, and religious scholars, as well as architects, painters, and calligraphers. Persians, i.e. Iranians who represented the Persian culture regardless of their ethnicity, were often treated as a sort of status symbol. The poet Hazin, who had lost revenue from his estate in Lahijan in Gilan province, could no longer finance his expensive peripatetic habit except by seeking patronage abroad. In 1742, after many years of travel and 8 years residing in India, mostly homesick, he penned the greater part of his autobiography in just 2 days. Interlaced with vivid accounts of the events of the period, his memoirs begin with his childhood and end with Nader's India campaign. Different from his nearly 200 Arabic and Persian literary and scholarly writings, Hazin's memoirs are written in a simple and direct style and in the first-person singular, allowing him to be unhindered in expressing emotions and impressions. The nostalgia for his homeland, which Hazin praises in his memoirs and his poetry, do not stop him from lamenting the destruction of cities, mass killings, famines, and cholera, and from criticising Nader's regime for imposing ruinous taxes and extracting them by force for his oppression and cruelty towards peasants and urban populace alike. Above all, for destroying the Safavid dynasty. He is particularly reproachable of the declining quality of political leadership throughout the Muslim world, an insight that must have been sharpened after the many interviews with the rulers of his time. Of the requisites of heavens in this age, he writes, one is that there is no leader qualified for kingship. As I pondered the condition of each of the kings and leaders and the commanders of the horizon, I found them more inferior and repulsive than most, if not all, their subjects, except some of the rulers of their countries of Europe, Farang, who are in firm enforcing laws, Kavanin, and in keeping means of livelihood and in taking care of their own affairs. Yet because of complete incompatibility, they are not beneficial to the people of other lands and climates. Hazin's first acquaintance with the Europeans of Bandar Abbas and later with those in India was likely the source of this praise, even though he underscored incompatibility with Muslim ways. Attraction to Farang was not quite enough to persuade Hazin to take advice of an English sea captain to immigrate to Europe rather than to India, a decision he later regretted. Hazin, nevertheless, was still open to new ideas and enthusiastic to learn about other cultures. While still in Isfahan, he had conversed with Christian missionaries and read the Gospels and other Christian theological works. He also discussed Judaism with Isfahan's rabbis and Zoroastrianism with Yazd priests, Mobads, though neither impressed him for what he suspected was their short-sightedness and bias. Hazin also spoke of his youthful love affair without specifying the gender of his affections, his protracted illnesses, which repeatedly caused him to be bedridden, and his extensive travels, which included at least 62 cities from Baghdad to Banaras. Furthermore, he crafted a careful list of his teachers, colleagues, and friends, as well as the men of learning among his contemporaries, and his own extensive writings. He wrote not only on the conventional learning of his time, including Aristotelian and Neoplatonic philosophies, mysticism, and jurisprudence, but also grappled with mathematics, physics, and astronomy. Though within the constellation of traditional Islamic learning, he demonstrates in his memoirs a rare sense of human agency, a voice of self-awareness and belief in historical causality. In his poetry too, Hazin, his pen name means the sorrowful, demonstrated a sense of proto-nationalism, no doubt edified by living in the Iranian diaspora. The land of Iran is the sublime paradise he exalted in a nostalgic poem. May its domain be under the ring of Solomon-like kings. May the sublime paradise be homeland, Vatan of our souls, not that ring fall into the hand of the demon. Aspiring for a Solomon-like king to rule over his homeland instead of the demons that have possessed the ring of power, invokes powerful cultural memories. These are contemplated by other cultural references to Iran as the kingdom of Faridun, the founder of the Khayanid legendary dynasty of the Shahnameh, the throne of Jamshid, the Persian name for Persepolis, the remains of the Arch of Khusro, the sustaining palace in Ctesiphon or Madain, north of Baghdad, and to Behistun, the double reference to the famous Achaemenid inscription near Kermanshah, and to the nearby Sasanian site, the Rum and the Rus were shivering, the day Kafirs beat the drums of war. It is as though Hazin wishfully was recalling was calling for a warrior king to end the Afghan occupation and repulse the Ottoman and Russian invasions. That may have already come through the rise of Nadir, whose patriotic yet destructive conduct resembled that of the Shahmana's Kai Kavus. Though through disaster and defeat one can detect flickers of a new national awareness, one no longer tied to Safavid sovereignty, but to the sorrowful memory of a glorious past, one that repeatedly would be invoked in the latter Iranian experience, the same melancholic awareness of the self-ban of Iran, narrated through an autobiographical account, can also be detected a generation later in the remarkable memoirs of Mirza Muhammad Kalantar, the longtime mayor of Shiraz under the Zands. Heir to an old land-owning family of Shiraz clergy and administrators, he was born during the last years of Safavid rule and lived long enough to write his memoirs around 1785 in the captivity of Agha Mohammad Khan in Tehran. Between his birth and incarceration, he witnessed the coming of the Afghan invaders, the horrors of Nader's army, the ruination of Fars following a prolonged struggle among the competing warlords, a fluctuating family fortune, and finally the wars of the succession that, much to his displeasure, made the Qajars masters of the land. Only a decade or two of tranquility of the Karim Khan era lightened his litany of misfortunes. And so as we can see, there is again this great longing for what was lost of Iran as this sort of great paradise of a country before the destructions of the 18th century. And again, one of the concepts I talked about when I did my introductory stream, this idea of in ancient Persian Zoroastrianism and Persian legend, this idea of Paradis, or heaven as a walled garden paradise. You can almost say that the 18th century was Iran's and paradise lost. And what do you think of that, Hunger?
No, I think that tracks. I think that's very fitting. It is definitely like we said, a very tumultuous period with very brief episodes of the common stability. And but again, as that entire passage demonstrates, the culture and the intellectual traditions didn't stop evolving. There was still art being produced. There was still philosophy being produced. This was a very productive time, artistically and culturally, for Iran, whether in spite or facilitated by the political chaos.
No, certainly. And just another comment from John, not real name. Does anybody else find the modern Iranian borders attractive, as in the opposite of border gore? Yeah, I'd say that's pretty fair. I do say I think the borders on this map are pretty nice. If only they'd maintained them.
I'm not so sure. I think the Caucasus was a lost cause.
You say that.
Bias.
Well, we know your reason that you're biased on that front, but when we discuss that next time, I will make the argument that the Caucasus was one entirely a lost cause, and there is a world where they could have maintained them, but that's for next time. So now to talk about the consolidation of the Qajars under Fath Ali. So as we see here, so he was someone very conscious of his image, and just look at the contrast between him and Aga Khan. Again, he's got this long flowing beard and this this great staff, and there's a kind of like an elegance and poise to him. And in one generation you go from this sort of like rough tribal Khan to this sort of sophisticated Persian Shah.
Yeah, the rough tribal eunuch versus the handsome, well dressed, bearded urbanite. I mean that's kind of the image that's being contrasted.
No, certainly, and it was also mentioned also sexually potent because it's almost like being conscious he had an uncle who was impotent. Fath Ali was like, I need to work my loins, and he would become the father of over 100 children, which is an absolutely incredible feat. So he had an absolutely massive harem and several wives, and this would cause some succession troubles when he died, but I think in the long run this was a very clever thing to do, because if anybody else who's watching who's played Crusader Kings 3, Fath Ali essentially employs the Crusader Kings 3 strategy of you produce a huge dynasty, and what you do is that when one of your vassals like rebels against you, you defeat them, revoke their titles and then just give them to a member of your dynasty, like one of your sons or nephews, and then you kind of just create a system where you have essentially a one dynasty form of feudalism where all of your vassals are just other members of your dynasty.
No, absolutely. He was kind of a Chad, in both senses of the term. yeah. The giant harem, the 100 plus children. So actually, the Crusader Kingster strategy is actually very pertinent, because this creates an entirely new dynastic class, the princely class of Qajar Persia, where these princes needed something to do, otherwise there would like probably be a likely outbreak of civil war. So what Fath Ali did was he positioned them in all of the governorates across the empire, and the crown prince, Chud Shah.
If only he had like thick rimmed spectacles. But yeah, I kind of see where you're going with that distant knight.
Yeah, one of his sons, not the oldest, but Abbas Mirza would later become his crown prince. He was the governor of Tabriz. And sorry, just to address one of John Not Real Name's other comments. If you want to bring up that comment on Shiraz and Kyoto, Japan.
Oh, yeah. Is that why Shiraz considered the cultural capital like Kyoto was in Japan? Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. I think Isfahan was much more culturally important than Shiraz. Shiraz was a very important city, obviously, but I think it eclipsed Isfahan as like the cultural heart of the empire.
Well, to clarify, so Shiraz, it's important that it's the main city of Fars, and obviously Fars is the etymologically origin of Persia. Fars, where we get the Farsi language or Persian language, and our word Persia comes from the original Iranian Pars or Fars. So again, it's got that kind of geographical core part of Iran's identity, and that's why it's so important. There's also obviously the Zand dynasty are one of the reasons Shiraz is so important, because they invested the city with so many monuments, as I've shown you earlier, like the Citadel and the Vakil. But it's not just the Zand. Throughout Iranian history, there are many other monuments. For example, the Persian poet of the 14th century, Hafez, who's one of Iran's most famous poets in history, he was from Shiraz, and the Zands actually built a new tomb for him. So again, it's a very important cultural city. And the only difference is that Kyoto was Japan's capital for centuries, and it was only with the coming of the Tokugawa dynasty that there was a conscious decision to move the capital away from Kyoto to Edo, later Tokyo. So similar, but not quite the same.
Yeah, just wanted to address that very, very quickly. But yeah, what Fath Ali did, going back to his dynasty, his sons, these prince governors of the provinces, a lot of them actually would take on the title of Shah, which would make Fath Ali the Shahanshah, which is again the king of kings. He saw himself as the king of kings, managing his sons, who would be the princely kings of their own regional centers. And what this did was this helped to balance out the tension between the center and the periphery, because Fath Ali was very how do I say it, light-handed, not light-handed, was very hands-off when it came to how his sons governed their various provinces. So this gave each of the provinces a semblance of autonomy, while still being very much under centralized monarchical power. And so, yeah, this was kind of the solution to the Persian political question of the center versus the periphery, the managing of the multiple ethnicities, by placing power and autonomy within the hands of these princes to manage their regions and their governates.
Yes, you don't deal with the Safed problem of the Qajars in one region, the Afshars in another, and all of these various Qizilbash clans. You essentially, just very interesting, isn't it? Because the Qajars were a Qizilbash clan, and it's like, well, we know this is a problem, and so we're just going to liquidate all the other clans and just make ourselves one big network of clans and control the entire country. So yeah, it's a genius strategy.
It is, and again, with the help of these Zand bureaucrats, and again with the help of all these princes. I think Amanat mentions in the book by 1860, which is 60 years after Fath Ali takes the throne of Shah. There are 10,000 princes in this priestly class. I mean that's just an incredible amount of power. And well, I mean it's an incredible amount of power in the hands of these princes that could be relied on to serve the Qajars and their bureaucrats that they carried over from the Zand dynasty.
Certainly, and I just want to read another bit from the Amanat book. So, the making of the Qajar era. So, during the first half of the 19th century, Qajar Iran partially recovered from the material losses of the previous decades. The slowing of the nomadic incursions in the periphery allowed a degree of stability, and the Persian model of government they had adopted brought a semblance of control over most of Iran proper. Agriculture recuperated and regional and international trade revitalized. Urban populations began to grow and the hinterlands were recouped. Yet by the end of Fath Ali Shah's reign, Iran's population still barely exceeded 4 million. And we should remember when the Safavid monarchy collapsed nearly a century before, the population was about 10 million. So the country lost 60% of its population as a result of all of these civil wars and collapse, essentially, which is absolutely brutal. And again, this is a recurring problem you see in Iranian history. So that when you have the Mongols come in and later the Timurids, and the population builds itself up, and then it just gets badly basically genocidal levels of death occur, and then it recovers. It's a recurring pattern. And facing European powers on its borders, both Russia and Britain, Qajar Iran appeared unprepared, began to sense the magnitude of challenges to its empire in war and diplomacy, while still recovering from ravages of the past. European powers defeated Iran in war, seized portions of its prized territory, put pressure on the state through diplomacy and trade, and at times even threatened its very sovereignty. At the outset of the 19th century, the east-west two-frontier of Iran of the Safavid and post-Safavid eras was substantially changed to a new north-south two-frontier reality. Qajar Iran's self-image as an empire at the centre of its own universe also changed into one of a nation vulnerable in the face of Christian powers. Yet despite its inherent disadvantages, Qajar Iran escaped domination by colonial powers in part because of the dictates of its geography, but also because of a degree of the resistance displayed by the Qajar state and its subjects. Iran endured within its shrunken borders while many countries in the non-Western world gradually succumbed to colonial rule. The Iranian state and society also began to adopt, in their own terms, selected aspects of European material and intellectual culture. The mixed experience of contention and adoption helped shape Iran's perceptions of modernity throughout the Qajar period. The early Qajar period also witnessed the emergence of potent Shia clerical establishment. It was conservative in outlook and at times defiant towards the state, suspicious of its modernizing measures. To maintain its network of privileges and social influence, the jurist establishment of the Usuli school articulated a legal theory that promoted believers' close following, taqlid of the mujtahids in all intricate matters of religious life. Grounded in Safavid learning, the Usuli school regulated not only the believer's behavior, but also society's moral and legal conduct through an elaborate set of rules and rituals. The Qajar state's desire to preserve the status quo helped sustain the Shiite jurists as a formidable force. Yet the symbiosis of the state and the ulama establishment acts as a barrier against innovative thinking and wider cultural adaptation. These themes have provoked contesting viewpoints about the Qajar period. Much historiography of the 20th century, influenced by a condescending European attitude, viewed the Qajar period as an age of defeat and decadence, such as an outlook belittles, if not discredits, the important achievements of the Qajar period, not only its survival as a sovereign state, but also its cultural rigidity. The early 19th century witnessed a literary and artistic revival of lasting influence. Shiite legal scholarship scored great gains. Despite their scholastic rigidity, Shiite jurists of the period articulated a complex discourse of methodology of law, better known as the principles of jurisprudence, usul al-fiqh, after which the Usuli school is named. The revival of the Aristotelian philosophy of the school of Isfahan also encouraged new approaches and produced new commentaries. The revival of Shiite Sufi orders, a legacy of the Zand period, counterbalanced the ulama in the cities at all levels and generated new theosophical and mystical works. The Qajar era also witnessed the rise of a new social-religious movement that espoused indigenous reforms embedded in the Persian Shia environment rather than wholesale imports from the outside. The Babi movement was the culmination of a process of descent within Shi'ism, with a message of religious and social renewal rooted in Iran's messianic experiences of the past. Later in the century, reformists of all shades, freethinkers, revolutionaries, state officials, and dissidents addressed moral and material decline, critiqued the social and cultural norms of their time, and offered either indigenous or Western-inspired syntheses. Qajar Iran displayed remarkable artistic and literary vitality in painting, calligraphy, bookmaking, music, and architecture, as well as in poetry and prose. Traditional industries and crafts, especially textiles, reached a new level of refinement, and Western technique and technologies, including the telegraph, photography, and book printing, gained popularity. These landmarks stand in contrast to the backdrop of depravity and misfortune with which the Qajar era has often been associated. And I'd actually largely agree with Amina. I'm being honest, I'm a bit of a revisionist when it comes to the Qajars, because the traditional view is to view them as a bit of a crap dynasty that, oh, they came in and they ruined the country, everything went to hell. And there's a tendency, in fact, just latching onto this comment by John, not real names, so in the context of colonialism was Iran or China. Yes, I would say the traditional view of the Qajars, which is interesting, isn't it? Because at this time, China's ruled by the Qing dynasty. So again, but what the commonalities between Iran and China, they're both ruled by these dynasties that begin with Q, funnily enough, and both dynasties are, technically you could argue, of foreign extraction. The Qajars are Turkic in origin, and the Qing in China are of Manchu origin. So you have these foreign dynasties coming in and establishing their rule, and both dynasties suffer humiliations at the hands of Western powers. Obviously, Iran suffers it during the Russo-Turkish Wars and against the British in terms of trying to retake control of Herat. And, the Qing suffer humiliations with the British vis-a-vis the Opium Wars, and the Russians vis-a-vis the northeastern frontier, and with northeastern Manchuria, and the Russians burning the Summer Palace. So yes, there are some very pertinent comparisons one can draw between Iran and China. We appear to have lost Hunger. Hopefully, there you are.
Sorry about that. Yeah, had some technical difficulties.
Oh no, it's fine. And yes, John, not real name. Your comment is very pertinent in terms of drawing a comparison between Qajar Iran and Qing China, and they're very, very pertinent. And I view the dynasty as, well, okay, the 19th century for Iran was definitely not great. But when you compare it to the 18th century, honestly, it looks like quite a rosy picture, for being really frank.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, addressing that point about the revisionism, it is the humiliations by losing the wars with Russia, and by losing the wars with Russia, that, color this whole dynasty. Again, this would also be a case of, the later regimes in Iran would be incredibly anti-Qajar and have huge amounts of propaganda to, I guess, poison the record of what the Qajar dynasty had accomplished. Again, they would specifically point to the failures of the Qajars and the loss of the Caucasian territories to the Russians, which was, of course, a huge humiliation. But the stabilization of the center and the survival of the state itself, when Persia could have splintered off into numerous kinds of kingdoms, just as what happened in India with the Mughals, that could have happened in Iran as well, but it didn't because of the Qajars.
And one of the things we noted is that, unlike the Safavids, Afshads, or Zand dynasties, all turmoil within Iran under the Qajars would be as a result of the encroachments of foreign powers. So again, there's almost like a national consciousness. So rather than having all these different little ethnic tribal uprisings, the Kurds are in revolt, or the Bakhtiari are in revolt, instead you have this idea of, we're all Iranians and we don't like the subversion of our country by these foreigners. So ironically, the encroachment of these Western powers onto Iran, the people stop fighting amongst themselves and coagulate into a new identity.
No, absolutely. We talked about the proto-nationalism of Nader Shah, but I think it really comes into existence Persia as a unified nation. It comes together under the Qajars.
No, absolutely. And yeah, so it should be noted that when Fath Ali first comes in, he does have to crush several uprisings. So there's the Sadek Khan, who was complicit in the murder of his uncle. He crushes him in Azerbaijan, as well as he crushes the Kurds of in the western provinces and some Asharid remnants in Khorasan. And he'd fully consolidated his realm by 1800. And now, what he then does, very interestingly, in 1801, he'd actually, as mentioned before, kept Haji Ibrahim Shirazi as his Grand Vizier. But in 1801, he actually has him executed. So, funnily enough, so Haji Ibrahim, in some way, ended up doing himself a disservice by defecting to the Qajars long term. But this is largely because Fath Ali does not trust him. And this is actually a recurring theme throughout the Qajar era, is the execution of Grand Viziers. The most ever famous one we see is Nasser al-Din Shah, the fourth Qajar Shah, would execute his Grand Vizier Amir Kabir a mere few years into his realm, and he was actually a very intelligent and strong reforming Grand Vizier. But ultimately, the Shahs don't want these Grand Viziers getting too much power and then facing a potential deposition. So on some angle, I don't think you can really blame them, because you can't be too careful, can we?
No, but again, many parallels with the Ottomans. These empires really are like these really are brother wars in some strange sense of the Ottomans and the Persians at this time. There's so many similarities in the court and the system of governing.
This is just like the Burgundians, really uncanny. Yeah, to an extent, I don't disagree with you, John, not real name. And so in terms of, we mentioned one of the earlier readings, there was a mention about these factionalism within the Divan. What ends up happening is there's a kind of with the increasing reliance on this new Divan for control, three factions emerge, and they're largely based on geography. So you have a southern Fars faction, a northern Mazandaran faction, and a central Farahan faction. And all of these are all played off against each other in order to try and climb the various ranks in the administration. So again, another China comparison with their the history of bureaucracy and examinations and the various rivalries in that respect. And another thing Fath Ali does is that he embraces this new court life, which emphasizes wealth and ceremony, as well as the public display of servants and other attendants. The holding of many public audiences or salam are royal portraits which emphasize the Shah's majesty and fashion sense. And what we also see is there's this palace in Tehran that's mentioned called the Golestan Palace, and this was actually built in the 16th century as a regional palace, but the Qajars take it as their main royal palace during their reign, and you can see it's an absolutely great big sort of grand building, and as mentioned, they loot many aspects of treasure, like the marble throne from the and some marble columns from the Zands. And Fath Ali actually has a new throne for the Qajar dynasty commissions called the Sun Throne, which is very, very grand, and that was used throughout their reign. And
if you notice at the top of it, there's a very prominent clock tower, which is very very interesting and very cool architecturally.
No, certainly, and just to go back to this slide, another thing Fath Ali does is he, like the Persian dynasties of the past, he has rock reliefs commissioned throughout the country. So this is a very most famous one. So on the right, this is called the Tangir Yevashi. It's in this gorge near Tehran. So you literally have to walk through this very tight gorge in the Alborz Mountains. It's a bit like the Petra in Jordan, and you find this great rock relief. And here we've got Fath Ali on the hunt with his men. Again, he's being, because again, this is a long-standing a Persian royal tradition of going on a hunt. So again, he's drawing this propagandistic connection with the traditional Persian royal kingship.
There's another portrait. I don't know if you have it in this slide, but in the book, there's a portrait of Fath Ali going on a hunt, hunting a lion. And again, this is a very kingly, regal tradition, going all the way back to ancient Persia. The hunting of lions was like the mark of the vitality of the king and the power of the king.
Certainly, I don't have that particular one, but what I do have here on the right is Fath Ali has a literary society called the Anjuman-i Khan, which he patronizes, and one of the writers is Ali Khan Sabas, and he commissions a book of poetry called the Shahansonama, which is an epic book detailing the deeds and exploits of Fath Ali, and this is a page from it. So this is like a court scene. So you've got Fath Ali, and you've got his son. I think that's a young Abbas Mirza on the right. So again, a deliberate links. Sounds suspiciously like the Shahnameh. So again, Fath Ali's got a very strong propaganda and culture game.
Indeed, he's maxed out on the art stats.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Going for the culture victory.
Yes, no, indeed.
If only the military was as successful.
No, certainly. I do just want to do one final reading before we wrap up for today. The royal progeny and the dilemma of succession. To further strengthen royal authority, Fath Ali also embarked on a long-term policy of ridding the throne of the troublesome Qajar chiefs, largely by installing in their place members of his own immediate family, especially a new generation of royal princes who were soon to come of age. In an incredible feat of reproduction, more than 100 sons and daughters were born to the Shah in less than 50 years, the outcome of maintaining a large harem with hundreds of wives and concubines. Fath Ali's conscious effort to compensate for the childlessness of his castrated uncle has been the subject of much criticism and ridicule by later observers. Though certainly he was not free from sensual indulgence and narcissistic extravagance, as evident from the reports of the period, having a large harem and many children was not without a political rationale. And the senior princes of the royal family liberated the Shah from the yoke of the rancorous Qajar Khans and provided him with the more reliable tools of governance. Political marriages, whether his own or those of his sons and daughters, fostered family ties with the Khans of the Qajar and other tribes, military officers, and urban dignitaries. Multitudes of royal offspring, moreover, were progeny of the captive Zand, Afshar, Kurd, and Lur wives. Others were born to Georgian and Armenian women captured during the earlier campaigns in the Caucasus, or to Jewish young women taken by consent or by force from communities throughout Iran. The Shah's son also created their own large strongholds in the image of their father. By the 1860s, some 3 decades after Fath Ali's death, the highly procreative Qajar princely class numbered about 10,000. In reclaiming imperial authority, Fath Ali Shah introduced a semi-autonomous system of princely governance under the umbrella of the central state. A legacy of the Safavid era and before that the Seljuk period, this feature gave new meaning to the official title of the country as the guarded domains of Iran. Senior princes mostly served as provincial governors in Tabriz, Shiraz, Kermanshah, Isfahan, and Mashhad, as high officials in the expanding Qajar court and military. Younger princes were sent to smaller governments. Creating regional governments was a realistic solution to the centre of periphery tension embedded in the geopolitical setup of Qajar Iran. There was a limited degree of interference from the capital, but the prince governors often acquiesced to the Shah's oversight. They were accompanied by their tutors, often high-ranking members of the Qajar nobility, and by senior bureaucrats who served as acting governors. Both officers reported directly to Tehran. Abbas Mirza, the crown prince and most celebrated of the Shah's sons, was sent off to Tabriz in 1799 with the title of viceroy. Naib al-Sultana, the highest of the princely ranks, his minister Mirza Isa Makam was a former Zand official of the Farahani faction and one of the most capable statesmen of the early Qajar period. Abbas Mirza came to Tabriz at a time when the city was recovering its position as a gateway to the Caucasus and beyond. It also became the centre for a flourishing trade with Europe through the Ottoman Black Sea port of Trabzon, and it maintained its overall prominence for the rest of the century as the most prosperous and most populated city in the realm. It was through Tabriz in the first quarter of the century that the earliest manifestations of the modern European military arrived: regimentation, new weaponry, drill officers, uniforms, and military education. Also through Azerbaijan came European and American missionaries, the press and publications, the earliest foreign newspapers, luxury goods, machine-manufactured fabrics, gadgets of all sorts, and the much-admired Sheffield penknives. The Tabriz administration was given significant latitude by the central government to conduct diplomacy and trade, and if necessary, war. In the northwest, Abbas Mirza's diplomatic engagements by both with Britain and Russia gave Qajar Iran its first taste of European empires. During the first 2 rounds of war with Russia, Tabriz served as the hub of diplomacy and the headquarters for conducting military operations. As the abode of sovereignty, Dar al-Sultanah, the official title of the city, Tabriz held control over its own army, finances, and regional affairs. Abbas Mirza himself not only held the title of viceroy, but also was frequently addressed by the title of Shah, in contrast to Fath Ali Shah's title Shahansa. Only toward the end of his father's reign was Abbas Mirza officially recognized as crown prince. Wali ad, literally the guardian of the royal covenants, Tehran's official name, Dar al-Khalifa, the abode of the Caliphate, an odd title for a Shiite capital, possibly claimed in competition with Istanbul as the capital of the Ottoman Caliphate, pointed to the multipolar nature of the Qajar sovereignty. The eastern Safavid capital, Herat, which also was referred to as Dar al-Sultanah, was never acquired by the Qajars despite several attempts. Azerbaijan's regional autonomy was offset by at least 3 other powerful princely seats in the south, the west, and the east, by several less prominent seats in Kerman, Isfahan, and Kurdistan. After ousting his rebellious brother, Fath Ali Shah assigned Fars and the Persian Gulf provinces to another of his senior sons, Hossein Ali Mirza, the same age as Abbas Mirza but of a non-Qajar mother, his official title being Farman Farmer, literally enforcer of royal decrees. Hossein Ali Mirza maintained regional autonomy in the south, as did Abbas Mirza. He survived in his post for more than 3 decades. Similarly, a vast domain in western Iran was assigned to the Shah's oldest son, Mohammad Ali Mirza, a bold and ambitious prince born to a Georgian mother whose title, Dawlat Shah, literally the Shah's political fortune, implied that he too was Shah of his own domain. He made it up until his death in 1821. Long-term tenure entrenched the princes in their provinces and fostered the all-too-familiar rivalry amongst the Shah's sons, yet the balancing act in the Qajar princely system proved successful insofar as it recognised the reality of Iran's regional diversity and helped the country's economic recovery. The manner of succession, however, despite efforts to regulate it, remained a contentious issue in early Qajar politics. Its domestic and foreign implications, competition for the succession, which had not been fully decided, began very early. To prove their worth, the princes were encouraged not only to rebuild the economy and secure calm in their domains, but also to resume territorial expansion along Iran's frontiers. The Shah gave his implicit consent for such campaigns, often carried out to deflect attention from internal strife. He even played a part in fostering some fraternal rivalry. Abbas Mirza's investiture as heir apparent in 1828 was not fully supported by all his ambitious brothers. Later, from the 1830s on, the struggle for succession further entangled the Qajar throne in a web of European imperial politics. And that is where I want to end this stream. So, exciting stuff, and next time we'll be looking at the rest of the reign of Fath Ali Shah, and we'll primarily be focusing on the wars with the Russians and the arrival of the British into Iran's foreign policy. And we'll also be looking at the rise of the Mojtahads, the jurist clerical class, and their influence on the domestic situation and foreign policy going forward. And is there any final comments you want to make before we get out of here, Hunger?
This was a great history. The Qajars are a very interesting dynasty, as we've seen. But I wanted to end. Maybe we can spend about 2 minutes. I wanted to ask you a question. Do you see anything in the Qajar period of time that that impresses on you on what's happening today? Do you see any parallels between the Qajars and where Iran is now, given the geopolitical situation?
Well, certainly with the struggle with the West, obviously with the Qajars, this is only just coming in, and they don't quite fully realise the position they're in until it's a little bit too late. But certainly there is a tension between wanting to modernise, but also wanting to maintain its own identity and sovereignty. I mean, the main through line, as I said, this is something we'll get into when we get to the next stream, is because as a result, when Nader Shah took over, many of the ulama actually fled Iran, and it's only under the Qajars that many of them return. And as a result of the weakening of the monarchy, as a result of these foreign incursions on the country's sovereignty, the people end up turning to the ulama as an alternate source of leadership. In the absence of strong shahs and a strong military. And you can almost say that the Qajar period is really where we see the pattern of the modern ulama and the the course that is taken eventually to the Islamic Revolution. I don't want to sound too deterministic, but you can see from the Qajars a logical pattern of how they came to be where they are today.
Yeah, I think in the case of the ulama, that's true. But I think if you want to understand, if you want to understand modern Iran really starts in the constitutional period, which is going to follow after the Qajars. We'll get into that. If you've watched our previous streams on the Arabs, the God damn it, what's it called? The Chatham, if you've watched our Chatham House series, Iran is also not immune from those influences in the early 1900s, and that's really where the Iranian state as we know it starts. But the Qajars is a very interesting prelude to all of that.
No, exactly. Just making sure we've not had any super chats. No super chats. So, well, thank you everybody for watching. As I said, I think at some point next month is when we'll do the next stream, but me and Hunger will work out a date for that. In terms of this channel, next Tuesday, we're going to be having the return of good friend Melon, Mike of Pole, and also another member of the OGC, hopefully Jay Ford. We're going to be doing a follow-up to the stream I did a couple of weeks ago on millennial culture. There was a lot of ground that was left untouched because we couldn't quite fit it all in, so we'll be revisiting that topic. It should be a absolute blast of a stream, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, I also have a stream coming up with 99 Iron Duke in a couple of weeks. We're going to be talking about Britain and Oman in the 1960s and 70s. And yeah, so if you're interested, give that a watch as well. Is there anything you want to show, Hunger?
Nope. I'm looking very forward to the millennial stream. As a very young millennial myself, there was a lot of good content on that stream. A very active comment section as well.
Yeah, indeed, and it's not, it can be a bit painful doing this. There's nostalgia, but hey, the etymological origin of nostalgia means pain.
It's a mix of love and cringe.
Yes,
definitely a mix of love and cringe.
Yes. As Nietzsche said, what one should not stare into an abyss too much.
Yes, very true. The past is a different country, and we should leave it there.
Yes, a very dysfunctional country. So thank you all for watching, and have a good day.